Hey Pop-Tarts! Back for Chapter 10 of Lauren Tarshis' I Survived the Attack of the Grizzlies 1967. Chapter 10. The man's name was Stephen Weiss. He was a wildlife scientist studying grizzly bears. He worked at the University of Montana. He told them all about his work as they sat outside the snack bar of the Lake McDonald Lodge. It was the big hotel across the lake from the ranger station. Aunt Cassie had suggested that Steve join them for lunch because it turned out they had a lot to talk about. They bought food and brought it to a picnic table near the lake. The water was so still it looked like a piece of light blue glass. Mel ignored her cheeseburger and opened up a bag of bugles. She popped one of the cone-shaped corn chips into her mouth. They were a brand new kind of snack and were all the rage at school this year. I want to know everything about the grizzly that followed you last night, Steve said. He pushed aside his burger and bottle of Coke to make room for a notebook. He scribbled away with his pen as Mel told him how the grizzly appeared from the woods and wound up on the porch. You did exactly the right thing, Steve said, looking impressed. You stayed calm. I don't think that bear was going to attack you. But the way it rose up like that, Mel said with a shudder. That's actually not usually an aggressive stance, he said. Bears stand up on their hind legs to get a better look at things. But if you had run, or if you had gotten into the cabin, I really don't know. Grizzlies are unpredictable, but I'd say you're lucky. Steve asked her how the bear looked, smelled, and sounded. He was especially interested in the claws. How long were they, he asked. Mel thought for a minute. She stared at one of her bugles, then slipped it over her finger. It looked to be about an inch long. Way longer than this, she said, holding up her bugle-topped finger. Steve nodded as he wrote. That makes sense. Grizzlies use their claws to dig for roots and little animals under the ground. It sounds like that grizzly isn't doing much digging. Steve asked her a few more questions and then finally closed his notebook. All summer there have been an unusually high number of reports of aggressive grizzlies, he said, picking up his burger. You're not the only one who's had a frightening experience. But why are the bears acting this way? Mel asked. There had to be a reason. She gazed at the smoke rising over the north end of the park. Is it the fires? Steve shook his head. It's not the fires, he said. There have been wildfires in Glacier since before it was a park. He pointed to their table, which was now covered with half-eaten burgers, crumpled wrappers, ketchup-covered napkins, and bottles of soda. This is the reason the bears are threatening humans. The bears want to eat our hamburgers, Aunt Cassie said. She glanced nervously at Mel, and Mel knew what she was thinking. That sounded, well, a little crazy. Steve shook his head. Not exactly. The problem is garbage, leftover food. There's trash everywhere in the park, on the trails, in the campgrounds, dumped in ditches. It's become a bigger and bigger problem in Glacier. Mel thought of Mom, hollering at people who littered. She pictured her tiny mother standing on the trail in her red bandana and peace sign t-shirt, scolding a gorilla-sized man for leaving his empty Coke bottle on the trail. Steve leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. Grizzlies are eating the garbage. Some grizzlies have almost stopped hunting and eating berries and plants. They're now eating garbage and whatever food they can find at the campgrounds. Steve told them more about the research he'd been doing, and suddenly what he was saying didn't sound crazy at all. As part of my research, I've also been studying grizzly scat, Steve went on. Mel tried not to smile. Scat was another word for animal poop. And it had become Kevin's favorite word. I have to go make a scat, he'd said yesterday morning as he ran to the outhouse. But what Steve was saying was serious. I've been finding grizzly scat with glass in it, pieces of metal and plastic, he continued. Last month, the rangers found a grizzly near a garbage dump. It had starved to death. It had glass embedded in its teeth. It probably couldn't eat. How terrible, Aunt Cassie said. Mel pushed away her food. She'd lost her appetite. It is, Steve went on. Some of these grizzlies are really suffering, and they're becoming more and more dangerous to people. They don't want to stay away from us. They think of us as a source of food. So that's why the grizzly followed me last night, Mel asked. It was looking for food? Steve nodded. I'm sure of it. And once it got to the cabin, it could smell the food inside. A bear's sense of smell is even more powerful than a dog's, and it saw you all as a threat to its food, and that's why it becomes so aggressive. Mel felt chills. There were hundreds of grizzlies in Glacier. What if all of them started stalking people? How could they feel safe in Glacier again? Something had to be done. So Glacier needs to be cleaned up, she said. Yes, Steve said, but there are other problems. Have you heard of the Granite Park Chalet? Of course, Aunt Cassie said. Mel had too. It was a rustic hotel for hikers way up in the mountains. Mom had always wanted to take Mel there. Wait until you see the view, she'd said. Is there a lot of garbage there? Mel asked. She hated to think of one of Mom's favorite places being littered with trash. It's worse than that. From what I hear, Steve said, lowering his voice, I've heard these strange rumors. I'm not even sure I believe them. I just know there's something happening with the Grizzlies up there, and I want to find out myself. I'm planning on hiking up there tomorrow. We should go too, Mel blurted out. Aunt Cassie raised her eyebrows. That's a long hike. 8 miles each way, Steve said. I'm going to stay overnight. You're welcome to join me. Cassie looked at Mel. You really want to go? Mel thought for a minute. She'd never hiked that far, and what if they saw a grizzly? But Mel didn't waver. Whatever was happening at Granite Chalet, she wanted to know. I can do it, she said. Cassie smiled. All right, it's a plan. They finished their lunch and gathered up their trash. The garbage can was already overflowing. Mel bent down and quickly picked up the wrappers and dirty napkins that were scattered across the ground. But then she looked around and saw there was litter everywhere. Broken glass glittered in the dirt. Paper bags lay crumpled under tables. There were even straw wrappers floating in the air, like ghostly little birds. It would take hours just to clean up this one small area. And that's when Mel truly understood all that Steve had told them. It wasn't the bears that were the problem in Glacier. It was the people. And we will continue with Chapter 11. Have a great day.